I had great mentors. So when you get into a difficult position or a place of extreme discomfort, you think about the people that provided the wisdom for you to get through difficult times in the past. You want to honor those mentors, and you want to replicate that as much as you can for younger folks who are, getting in a very difficult, demanding environment and trying to find their way through that.
My guest today is the legendary Bill Cameron. Bill is a retired Navy officer and aviator whose career spans flying helicopters off of Navy ships, briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and even serving in the White House during 9/11.
I actually believe most people that wore the uniform fully knew that we're as vulnerable to an attack like that as any other country. And perhaps it required something like that for our country to wake up to what those threats are.
Now retired from the service, Bill's mission continues through his co-founding of Velo Solutions, a cybersecurity firm focused on strengthening the defense of America's partner nations.
Their legacy networks, they're corrupted. We increasingly can't share information with our allies in key parts of the world, whether it's Eastern Europe or Central and South America or Asia, and our adversaries are increasing their cybersecurity capabilities at a faster rate.
Bill is a seasoned leader, an inspired child of America's space program, and a firm believer in the American way of life. Our conversation was as broad as it was fascinating, and as always, found a footing in remaining optimistic. And now, here's Bill Cameron. I have Bill Cameron in front of me. Bill, could you give us a quick overview on yourself?
Oh boy, okay. I'll do the best I can. I'm a retired Navy officer. I grew up in the Southeast. Went to Navy flight school when I graduated from college, and I made that a career. So I was in for 26 years. And since 2010, I've been in the private sector. I worked for an Australian company for 5 or 6 years. And then when my girls graduated from college, went out on my own as a consultant. And then about 6 years ago, I met a gentleman named Jim Hathaway, and we formed a cybersecurity company just focusing on partner nation cybersecurity. That's our allies who take funding from the United States government for their own cybersecurity needs. So that's a work history, but I have a family, I have grandkids, and I'm just happy to be here.
Yeah,
as part of life.
There's a couple things that I definitely want to spend some time talking about today. The partner nation spin on cybersecurity is one that we haven't addressed on the podcast yet. We've not had someone with that as their focus. We talk a lot about, the geopolitical stuff with the country and critical infrastructure of the U.S. We don't delve into partner nations a whole lot, and it's not something that's been on my mind until, prepping for this podcast and thinking, oh yeah, that's a whole mission set of its own. So
right.
What brought you into that particular side of cybersecurity? And maybe tell us a bit more about what's going on in that world.
Sure. From an interest area, I was an aviator in the Navy, but when I wasn't flying airplanes or helicopters, I was working on strategy policy types of things. So working with other allies, other nations that are with us in all parts of the world, doing various security things together. So for me, it was kind of a natural focus area to want to work with partner nations. But my business partner and I saw a need with partner nations. Their networks are, their legacy networks, they're corrupted. We increasingly can't share information with our allies in key parts of the world, whether it's Eastern Europe or Central and South America or Asia, and our adversaries are increasing their cybersecurity capabilities at a faster rate. And so their networks are they need our assistance with those, and it's going to be a real issue, real problem.
What kind of support, other than, I guess, funding, right, to put companies like yours in position to help those countries? Is there like strategic guidance we also give to partner nations on that?
We do strategic guidance. I would say from what we're trying to accomplish, we're trying to bring foundational cybersecurity. So the big issues that we see with our partner nations, whether it's Eastern Europe or Central and South America, is they need the foundational items. First off is the skill set. They need to skill up their cybersecurity workforce. They have some really smart people who understand network and network security, but they need the workforce that's trained in order to maintain them and increase that resilience in the network. And the other part, of course, is their legacy. Most of the networks that we see are, would be something that looked like something here in the early 2000s.
Okay.
So they have real foundational needs in terms of hardware and software. Most of what we're doing, I would say 95% of it is foundational stuff. Good servers, good routers, good switching, basic software defensive tools. Almost all of it is what we consider COTS. There's no ITAR component to it, so there aren't really any export restrictions. They need the foundation stuff.
If people don't know, ITAR, that's international traffic and arms regulations, that's export control type stuff, and then COTS, commercial off the shelf. When we talk about these partner nations and them being so kind of behind, do we see as a country in our policy and helping them, do we see it because they make us vulnerable? Like as a country, because they're connected to us in some way, or is it more like, hey, we just want them to be strong because they have to go against the same sort of adversaries that we do without the same resourcing?
I would say yes.
Right. Okay, cool.
Both.
All right.
Yeah. We want to be able to share things like strategy, training results, do simulations, exercises, all those types of things that we need to do cooperatively as allies do to meet the threat from our adversaries. And of course, we want to provide strategic guidance, help for their network support. And they're out there on the front line. Many of these countries border some of our key adversaries. There are all sorts of second and third order effects when their networks are susceptible to network attacks, whether they're economic or there could be border security issues or transnational crime. So though most of our work is focused on military networks and intel networks, we see increasingly the other effects on civilian infrastructure, particularly supply chain in most of these countries.
Yeah. We talk a lot about on our podcast, of course, because we're very U.S. national security focused as a topic on the podcast. But we talk so much about the PRC and North Korea and Russia and Iran and those like major threats and how they attack us and the volume of attack on our infrastructure. Are they doing the same at partner nations at the same level?
Can you rephrase that question?
Like, is China and Russia, they attack us so frequently with so much resources. Are they doing the same to partner nations?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. We're working, we've spent some time in Romania. We were working with the embassy to work with some agencies in Bucharest. And they have a state-owned gas company by the name of Romgas. Romgas is trying to produce a natural gas field in the Black Sea, which could make the Balkans energy independent, right, from Russia. And we know that their networks are completely corrupt and they're being attacked on a daily basis. And that adversarial nation wants to do whatever it can to prevent that natural gas field from being developed, right? That's one instance. Another one would be the air traffic control system. Since the Ukrainian invasion, all that air traffic that used to go over Ukraine has been directed to go over Romanian airspace. So their airspace quintupled overnight, essentially. So they went from like 200,000 overflights to 1.2, 1.3 million overflights a year. And their air traffic control system is being jammed, weakened, all that, 24/7 basis by Russia. So there are these things are happening on a daily basis. And a lot of times we don't get a chance to read about those, but our partner nations are fighting these battles every day.
Right. And without all the resourcing and attention. Right. So it's almost like they've kind of got one hand behind the back as well.
Absolutely.
Now from the support, that we provide as a country to our partner nations, does it include like on the ground, like boots on the ground type support?
It can. And typically that would be on the skill side of training, right? Where we're trying to help that country increase
develop to defend themselves.
That's right. They have the ability to defend themselves. that takes time. You can't just grow middle managers overnight. You can't grow that experience base that you need to manage people of the skill set. So that's a long-term effort. It's still obviously a long-term effort in our own country, right? So we have great needs as well. So that's a key shortage everywhere in the world we look, is basic cyber capacity and skill set.
Do you see the highest levels of our government that it's seen as a strategic issue that we do need to be providing cybersecurity support to partner nations? Like, do they get it?
Yeah, there are people in the U.S. government who get it. We are working with U.S. embassies every day. In fact, I was on a call with a very strategic, with an embassy in a very strategic location in Central America as I was driving over here. One of the issues we have in our embassies now is we don't have people with cybersecurity skills. We normally work through our defense attaché offices or offices of defense cooperation. And the people that work there, they're familiar with the Lockheed Martins and the Northrop Grummans and, the traditional companies that do defense work, but very few of them can name a cybersecurity company. And so we have to, part of what we're doing is educating them on the industry itself. And then, how can we actually bring capability to that partner nation, to that ally, for network support? So it's a multi-pronged effort. We're getting better, but we're moving a little bit slowly. I believe Tatiana Bolton was on here recently, and we talked about the Strategic Cybersecurity Coalition that we formed, but we have that up and running now, and so we're making strides there.
Is that to pull everyone kind of together to lift everyone up?
Right. We were able to bring in some companies together, cybersecurity companies, major ones, to form a coalition to educate our government on the issues surrounding partner nation cybersecurity and the really important role that the U.S. government has in providing that support. We are still, in my view, the indispensable country, particularly in cybersecurity, right? I mean, we drive in this corridor all the time between Dulles Airport and Tyson's Corner, where all the cybersecurity companies are located. If you're a cybersecurity company, you probably got your start in Palo Alto or somewhere in California, and you do great selling commercially. You know how to do that. But if you want to sell to the U.S. government, you have to be in this corridor. You have to work with a company, say like Carahsoft, who understands how the government works, and then you have to get in front of your customers. We're doing the same thing with our partner nations. We rely on that same ecosystem, but we have to work with those partner nations and our government at the same time. So we're dealing with two different bureaucracies. We're dealing with the partner nation bureaucracy, and we're dealing with the U.S. government bureaucracy.
Right, and there's already like full-time jobs to translate our federal government bureaucracy. Add that complexity.
Right.
Sure, that takes a special skill set. You mentioned, the corridor where we're at, where we film the studio is in Loudoun County, which we've had folks come on before, and I know the estimation's like 80% of the internet flows through here, but it's just data center after data center after data center, all right here. And then big companies like you mentioned, like Carahsoft, are homed here. And I laughed a little bit when you talk about like the Palo Alto cybersecurity startup and the translation to working with the federal government. My company, we do occasionally we work with a small startup that's got that very West Coast attitude, the move fast, break things. And part of why they work with us is we're defense contractor specialists. We help them translate their programs to be compliant with regulation.
Right.
And boy, is it create drag for them, and it's a hard adjustment for them because they're like, hold on, we don't take away admin rights from our computers. Like, we're developers. We have to have full control of every system. And we have to tell them, listen, that's not the way the federal government feels about its data that it's going to share with you. And there's just a lot of struggle sometimes for them to figure out how to remain innovative, but still work within the new confines of, supporting the government.
Yeah, that's always a difficult thing when you're an entrepreneurial minded company and you come up against the federal government with its many tentacles and restrictions. And so we deal with the same thing at our company, Vela Solutions. We're trying to bring that cybersecurity to our partner nations, of course, but we do it within the confines of foreign military funding on the Department of Defense side, or from the State Department side, it'd be grant aid funding. So if we had a moniker or something like that, it wouldn't be move fast and break things. It would be move fast and try to change things, which is why we formed this cybersecurity coalition. We're actually trying to change some of the partner nation acquisition laws so that we can move much more quickly. Unfortunately, in our business, what we're seeing is it takes somewhere between 3 and 5 years to deliver the cybersecurity solutions that these partner nations need in their networks. 3 to 5 years can be 3, sometimes 4 different technology cycles. That's not going to work in cybersecurity. So that's why we formed the coalition, so we can move that acquisition timeline from 3 to 5 years to hopefully 1 year, sometimes even less. So that's where we're trying to change things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's we use this term recently on a podcast. Might even have been Tatiana talking about the speed of relevance.
That's it.
That's what we got to keep pace with, and that seems to be a tightening timeline with new technologies like AI advancing things quicker.
Right.
That 3 to 5 year timeline to field new capabilities, not acceptable.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have these conversations with our partner nations. We've had several governments that say, "Oh, use U.S. grant aid money or security assistance money for." We would never do that because it takes way too long to get that assistance. And so, that works fine maybe for major weapons platforms where you have to, make sure you get the supply chain right and you get the engineering support right and the training piece right and the maintenance piece right. That takes time. But, when we're talking software especially, we can deploy those solutions literally overnight.
Right.
So we're working to change that.
I know in your career history, there was a time you worked with the Australians.
Right.
And one thing I've heard through the cyber industry is there's actually some learning we can do from Australia's cyber program. I understand they've had a lot of success. I think is it Cyber Essentials they have or Cyber 10, something like that. They've got like a national level program.
Not as familiar with what's happening in Australia. We tend to work with less developed countries who need our funding assistance. So that's been a little bit off my radar. I do know they've taken a much more of a leadership role in the region because of where they sit strategically.
Yeah,
and I do know they're starting to see our major adversary in that part of the world the same way that we see it. When I was working there, that wasn't necessarily the case.
Oh no?
Okay. Yeah. But they've had a number of issues in their own country, in Australia, with that particular adversary. So there is much more of a leadership role within that region and they've always had that leadership role in that region. But on the cybersecurity side, they've taken the reins.
Yeah. Is that because they're seeing the impact of China?
Of course. Yeah.
And so China's actively targeting them as well.
I'm assuming that they are.
Yeah.
We have to assume that's true. But Russia is Australia in that part of the world is a very, very important ally, and they're a hegemon in that region, and they tend to maintain security in that part of the world alongside us. So very, very important player in the Pacific.
So you're leading a cybersecurity company that helps partner nations. But we started by saying you started a career in the Navy as an officer and as an aviator.
Right.
It might be a hard line to draw the connection.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Right. I completely agree. If somebody told me 20 years ago I'd be working in the cybersecurity industry, I would shake my head. I would say I got into through a side door because worked in an embassy overseas, working in DoD policy, some circles, and was familiar with the FMF system. When I departed my last company in 2015, somebody asked me, "Hey, would you help me do some consulting work?" It was a cybersecurity company. So I kind of got an introduction to that. And then we started trying to work to get some government funding. So it led me into different foreign embassies here in Washington, and I had some exposure to what they were up against. And then we started paying attention to what their needs were and having more conversations. And then we really said, okay, this is a need. It's a problem unsolved. That's why a lot of people start businesses, right? There's an unmet need, and we see this as a big need. So let's form a company and see if we can make a difference. I would say, and you probably feel this too, Andy, when you come out of the military, or if you've served before in some capacity, whether it's civilian government agency, you tend to be mission focused. I struggled leaving the service, trying to find the right niche, the right place where I think I could make a difference and still put bread on the table, so to speak. This is that place for me.
Yeah.
I'm in a place where I can do something that's mission oriented and make a difference. And we're doing that slowly but surely, I believe. And it's a great place to be.
Well, there's something that speaks to me about it being probably underserved as well. Developing partner nations like in South America, that you mentioned, that don't have the resources, that have the same need.
Right.
We had early on when we first started the podcast, I think it was our second or third episode, we had a gentleman named Robert Potter on, and he's an Australian that's spent the last several years in Ukraine, helping their cyber defense during the invasion and
Right.
after. Shared a lot of very interesting insight about the prep that went into that and how much our resourcing and assistance helped them defend themselves successfully. Because remember, we all thought Ukraine was going to fall in a couple of days.
Right.
That ever since having that conversation, I've thought a lot more about the U.S.'s role in helping our partner nations defend themselves, more than just kinetically, but in cybersecurity space as well. So I imagine that being pretty fulfilling to have that mission where it's an unmet need like that.
And you can see in Ukraine, that's a great example of where our involvement has made a very, very huge difference. Before the invasion, Ukraine was already a laboratory for their major adversary to be involved in networks. They were taking down television stations, telecommunication stations, critical infrastructure, power grids. That was all happening, and the Ukrainian were fighting through that attacks on their civilian infrastructure. Right, so they knew that after the invasion, their network's going to be completely attacked. And it's a very interesting case study because, as you're fully aware, they had to depend on the cloud.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if they hadn't had that ability to push their data into the cloud, they would have lost everything.
Yeah.
Right. So we see that same issue in a lot of the countries that we're dealing with. Is they want to maintain an on-prem solution.
They love the sovereign control.
They love the sovereign control, and that's written in their laws that way. We have to have sovereign control over our data, but that's not going to work in a major conflict or event, right?
Yeah. One of the things Robert Potter was telling us when he came on the podcast was exactly that. They relied on the cloud, and they had solutions and data in foreign countries that kind of kept the Russians at bay a bit, because Russia didn't want to be so aggressive. In Ukraine's case, Russia's literally bombing Ukrainian data centers. They're not going to bomb data centers in a NATO country.
Right.
And so they benefited greatly from putting their data in countries that Russia would not attack at that level.
Yeah. And it's interesting. We're seeing some of the same thing with this recent SharePoint cybersecurity attacks, right? The people that have had SharePoint in the cloud seem to be doing just fine.
Yeah.
The people that had SharePoint in an on-prem solution are doing so well, right? So there's, so you see that some of that similar dynamic playing out across other cybersecurity type of attacks. When you talk about what was happening in Ukraine and Russia making decisions about where they're going to attack, absolutely. If you have that information distributed to your other allies, particularly if you're border NATO countries and you have those NATO allies, they're not going to go there. Russia has to make very discrete and significant decisions about where they're going to escalate, right? So have you had conversations here in this forum about cybersecurity and about escalation?
A bit. We talk about the increasing escalation of where the boundaries are, because it used to be cyber criminals and financial motivated stuff. And now it's, no, they're in our water supply. They're in our electric companies. Like, we're clearly escalating. You can draw the line between a cyber attack and a human death, multiple in this country now.
Yeah.
And so we've talked a lot about this escalation, and we've always sort of talked about this idea of a cyber Pearl Harbor or 9/11 sort of thing,
Right.
where it's like, is this the thing that's got to happen for everyone to finally take it all so seriously? What I always come back to when we have that conversation is I think our adversaries are very smart in how they escalate. They never make a big dramatic crossing of the line. Could they cripple our water supply in a meaningful way overnight? Sure, they
Yeah.
probably could,
Right.
but they don't because they know what the response would be. So instead, they just sort of pick at it,
So here's a question I have for you. Have you met anybody in your career who's familiar with or who has postulated a cybersecurity escalation regime or theory? How do cybersecurity, how do nation state actors escalate in the cybersecurity realm?
No, I don't think so. We've I think hypothesized a bit about when does kinetic become a valid response, and I don't know that anyone's clearly defined what they think the line should be.
Interesting. There was an economist, I think he was an economist, named Thomas Schelling, who wrote a book about nuclear escalation theory in the late 50s, early 60s, as I recall. I think we could find a lot of parallels between his theory about nuclear escalation and modern cybersecurity escalation. I'd like to be able to dig more into that and see if there are any real world examples of that, or I'm sure our big thinkers, strategic thinkers at Cybercom think about that all the time.
Yeah.
But in the commercial space, wish we could delve more into that.
I think there is a parallel there. I was having this thought the other day because I was listening to a podcast talking about AI. And sometimes, you listen to a podcast about AI and they're talking about how it's going to totally change the world. We're in the AI revolution. And then you'll listen to another one where they're much more like AI is just smart math guys. Well, I was listening to one that's like, hey, we're at the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution with AI and the impact AI could have on our society. I was having the thought that this is almost like nuclear weaponry in terms of the societal impact these attacks could have. Like, sure, maybe not the devastation and loss of life of a nuclear weapon, but the disruption that it could cause to society if, say, an adversary said, we're going to turn off as much of your electricity and water as we can. That's going to cause major societal damage.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely a parallel there.
I do too. I think the more I think about it, we're going to see those types of attacks in our lifetime. Our government's going to be, or the political parties or our government's going to be under tremendous pressure to respond to that. And then what happens? What do they do with that?
Right. Does the concept of mutually assured destruction work in this?
Yeah, there is that concept is there. So I think we're going to see a lot of parallels between nuclear escalation theory and cybersecurity escalation. We just haven't seen a lot of it yet, but I think we're going to have some incident that will demonstrate that, right?
Yeah, especially again, go back to like we're increasingly escalating. They're in hospitals, they're in water supply. This is no longer we're in your private company stealing your data, which we already dislike.
That's already happening.
Yeah, the loss of data, okay, that's not good. It sucks that they can build a fighter jet that looks an awful lot like an F-35. But hey, that wasn't impacting us in a kinetic way where we can point to people losing their lives in hospitals because the hospital IT systems have been brought down by an adversary.
Yeah. And when you can't go to an ATM machine and pull cash out, or you can't use your debit card somewhere, or you can't turn on running water at home, that's when you're gonna have some real societal impacts, and then pressure on the government to do different things, go into places they've never been before. So it'll be, we're in an interesting world.
Yeah, I've said this a number of times on this podcast that, and it's not a quote I can claim as mine. I heard it somewhere that society is only ever 3 meals away from total collapse. And like if you disrupt society at that level for enough time, like are we resilient? Sure. How resilient are we? How quickly do things devolve when people can't get basic necessities like water, or their power's out for an extended period of time? They can't feed their families.
Right.
An adversary could cause a lot of damage. Now, it goes back to that theory. Hopefully they understand we would respond in such a kind that they wouldn't do that. But that is that parallel.
Yeah.
I hadn't really connected that thought until now. Now I'm a little more terrified than I should be.
Yeah, I think we're all a little bit. It's probably good to be a little bit terrified.
Yeah, respect of the problem, I think. Will mean we take it seriously.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to your career.
Sure.
And maybe just let's go all the way back. What put you in the Navy? How'd you end up in the Navy? Was that something that you always knew you wanted to do, or did you kind of decide late?
Yeah, when I reflect back on that, I think, like most of us, our parents had a big influence, a big impact on that. My parents were scientists, so they had inquisitive minds. I grew up in a university town in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, during the Apollo years. It turns out that Chapel Hill was where the Apollo astronauts went to learn, and the Gemini astronauts went to learn celestial navigation.
Really?
They had one of the only planetariums of its type in the world at the time. They had a special Zeiss instrument that there's only 2 or 3 locations in the U.S. had that. It was closer to the Capes. It was much closer for them to go from the Cape or Houston to Chapel Hill to study celestial navigation. I didn't realize it at the time, but of course they didn't have GPS, right? They didn't have all the modern computer systems we have on board. Every time they fired a rocket engine, the vibration and the motion was such that you had to recalibrate your navigation systems. That's why they had a sextant in the command module and a sextant in the lunar lander. So every time they fired that engine, they would have to reorient themselves to 4 or 5 different stars, get that point in space before they fired the rocket engine again. So I grew up in that area when that was going around and became, in these kids programs, all that stuff. So aviation for me, as I got older, was kind of a natural place that I wanted to be. I wanted to be an astronaut. Navy had other designs.
Such a
was
cool
fine.
connection that
Yeah.
that the sextant just put in my brain. Like thinking of a movie I saw, like Master and Commander, about like the Navy in the 1800s, and they're using a sextant.
Right.
And then sure enough, 200 years later, there's guys in space using that to navigate.
Right.
Makes sense, I think, why so many of the Gemini and Apollo astronauts were aviators, Navy aviators especially.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I would assume that, or at least I would hope that our guys who are astronauts now, guys and gals, they still have some of those basic skills using just the stars to fix a point in space in the case they need to be able to do that. That was a necessity, obviously, during the Apollo era. So there was that influence going on. There was that aviation piece. And when I was looking to figure out what I want to do with my life, coming out of college, said, hey, I want to make that. I don't know what I want to do the rest of my career, but I want to do this as a young guy, and we'll see where it takes me. And yeah.
So did you do like an ROTC program or officer candidate school?
I was an officer candidate. I came out and went through something called the AVROC program, where you could sign up as a sophomore and then go to aviation officer candidate school between your junior and senior year. And then when you graduated, you finished off the last half of that, and then you went on to flight school. So that's the program I went into. And I was lucky that I got into flight school during the Reagan buildup, right? It poured a lot of resources into fighting that last stage of the Cold War. And so there's a huge buildup and a need for pilots, and got sucked into all that, fortunately or unfortunately.
When you
right?
go into that sort of training program, do you do fixed wing and rotary?
In the Navy, we all start off flying fixed wing. We all
Okay.
start off flying fixed wing and learning how to fly what we would call a carrier landing pattern, right? So you learn how to recover on so eventually you're landing on a ship of some type, right? We all start the same way, which is
Yeah.
great.
And what did you end up ultimately flying?
Ended up flying helicopters. It was first helicopter I flew in the fleet was called an H-2 Sea Sprite. It was the first helicopter that we used to fly off of small ships, so frigates and destroyers and cruisers in the day. And these ships were not built as aviation ships. They were modified to handle aviation helicopters. So the initial ships that we were flying off weren't suited for flying. And so there was a rough time in those initial years.
In terms of danger?
We lost more helicopter pilots in those aircraft than any other type in the Navy for several years running. So it was a difficult transition. It's different now. We design Navy ships with the flight deck on the back with integrated shipboard landing visual systems to make things less demanding in particular environments. So it's gotten way better, thankfully.
Right. Would this have been sort of like the early stage of doing, rotary wing stuff in the Navy at the time? So,
I wouldn't say it was early stage rotary wing. We were flying helicopters off of carriers and mainly a search and rescue role. As ASW anti-submarine warfare became more important with the rise of the Soviet nuclear capability, submarine capability, we had to get better. So we started putting helicopters in the back of small ships to take over some of that role. So it wasn't just carrier based. We could push anti-submarine warfare capability with aviation assets much further away from the carrier than we could before. So there was a mission imperative to put helicopters on the back of small ships. As we became more mature, we needed more capability, and we do things like maritime strike as well against small boat threat or other types of threats on the outer zone or inner zone, as you would say, with helicopters. So it's matured over the last 40, 50 years. The early days were tough.
yeah. Maybe you can clear something up for me. Maybe I don't ask you to speak for the whole aviation community, but I've never looked at a fighter jet or a helicopter and thought whoever's flying that must hate their life. I mean, no matter what, I'm always like that looks like maybe the coolest job on the planet. Or we'll literally.
Yeah, I think we were kind of romanticize that as young people. We're trying to figure out what we want to do with our lives. I think once you get into it, you realize it's a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
I would say that flight school for me was one of the most difficult things that I ever went through. And then deploying on a ship for 6, 8 months at a time was also difficult. And most people don't realize there's 6 to 8 months of workups before you ever make a deployment. And that's difficult too, in its own way, because you're in and out all the time. And if you have a spouse, if you're married or a family, that's even more difficult. You're not just gone, you're in and out. And so there's constant readjustments being made there. So when I was a younger aviator, I was more immortal. I wasn't as worried about that type of thing. When I got older in a leadership job and I had a family of my own, I found that way more difficult. Now you have to lead and mentor younger people and teach them, how to stay alive, particularly on really dark nights. But you have to bear that responsibility and of your family as well. I found that way more difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine, because when you can reflect on how you thought about things, like say you're in your early 20s out of college, flying aircraft, feeling fairly immortal, maybe not necessarily reckless, but more willing to take risk. And then later in life, looking back at that, knowing how you thought, and then having to mentor people where you're like, I know what you're thinking. I know how reckless you feel and how immortal you feel. How can I convince you to take the threat seriously is a challenge in and of itself.
Absolutely. And of course you live that life and you know how they're thinking. And you wish you could go back to thinking like that in a lot of ways, but you can't do that. You can't do that for the sake of the organization. You can't do that for their own sake and their family's sake, because there are too many hard lessons learned along the way, obviously. So yeah, you have to be the old man pretty quickly in the service.
I think about this a lot just in my personal life with my kids, thinking about the things I did as a teenager and in my early 20s and the fast cars and that kind of stuff. And just now I'm terrified knowing what I know and having seen what I've seen through my paramedic career. Like, man, the number of times I barely got by. And now I'm just like, how do I instill this in my kids when they're young? Like, please wear your helmet, put your seatbelt on, all that sort of stuff. It's enough to keep a dad a little anxious, Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. I would say in our profession, the hardest part for middle management or leaders is during the workup phase when we're trying to learn how to work together as a team. A lot of us are in a new environment. We're in brand new roles. We're feeling each other out, and yet we're having to go out and fly and be expected to perform at a pretty high level. Those situations, those workups can be way more stressful and demanding even than the actual deployment. And the combat's a different ball of wax altogether. I don't want to denigrate that at all, but in our profession, and a lot of military services, that workup phase can be very, very, very stressful and very demanding. And that's when a lot of accidents happen, frankly.
Yeah, I can imagine the new environment and
Right.
challenging new things, and training in general, just it's not without danger. I think maybe some people think because it's not a combat environment, it's
Yeah.
not dangerous. No, it's almost every year or so I see some sort of story, especially around helicopters.
Yeah. And we train, to be fair, our services train to be the best that we can. We push each other in training so that we are prepared when the balloon goes up, so to speak. So that's just our culture, and it has its weaknesses and its strengths, and mainly strengths. But that's our system, that's our culture, and we embrace that.
So, from being an aviator to then leading aviators, I'm curious. My experience with military officers in general has been they're some of the strongest leaders, and I think the military institution of developing leaders is a well-oiled machine with all the training and everything that goes into it. I'm curious if I could set you up for a soundbite, like what makes an effective and a good leader in that type of environment?
Boy, that's a very good question. For me personally, I had great mentors. So when you get into a difficult position or a place of extreme discomfort, you think about the people that provided the wisdom for you to get through difficult times in the past. And I think about the mentors that I had, and I can name those mentors on one hand, right? And so I tend to fall back on those leaders that came before me when I'm looking for a way to get through that trouble time. So probably like yourself, you want to honor those mentors, and you want to replicate that as much as you can for younger folks who are, getting in a very difficult, demanding environment and trying to find their way through that.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons I've been learning, the journey I've been on as a growing leader, has been at least to my experience, there's no secret sauce. There's no magic solution. There's no algorithm I can follow to make the right decisions. It's a lot of talking to mentors, talking to people who've been there. It's a lot of intuition and a lot of following sort of your gut and sticking with your values.
Right.
That I found a bit surprising. But mentors, I think that speaks to me. Like that sounds like that's been my experience, and it gives me confidence. Hey, that's the path I've taken in a lot of things. Like, hey, build a network of people you can call who will hear you out and tell you the truth and say like, yeah, no, that's a tough call, and you got to make that call, and there's no easy answer.
Right. I think anytime you're trying to succeed in any endeavor, whether it's business or in a military organization, you're going to face difficult times. You're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
You're going to, if you're lucky, you're going to find people who confront you with your mistakes pretty quickly, so you can recalibrate, readjust, try to do the right thing. I think most people that I've worked with, whether in business or in service, we try to do the right thing every day. Unfortunately, we're humans. We're flawed to some degree. We're emotional beings. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to upset people we don't want to upset. We're going to do things or say things to our loved ones that we regret. We have to learn from that, and we have to pick ourselves off the floor every day and try to, progress, move forward in some fashion. I don't think that ever stops. I turned 65 this year. I have a Medicare card. The learning will never stop. The failing will never stop. Trying to move forward will never stop. That's just where we are. That's as humans trying to do the right thing.
I think some of the historical figures I admire most, one of the common threads you can pull through them is always learning to their very last days. Thomas Jefferson comes to mind,
Wow.
an admirable
Yep.
human being who just like to the end was just innovating and thinking and asking questions and trying to learn. I think that makes interesting people, but also I think makes effective people and effective leaders. And yeah, going back to leadership and sort of the lessons, I've learned to accept that there aren't easy answers all the time, and that you are going to have to make a decision, and you are going to have to be the one to take accountability when that was the wrong decision. And you have to be comfortable with, yeah, no, I made the bad call. I made the call I thought was right in the time. And as
Right.
long as I can justify I was trying to do it right, you can be pretty comfortable with that, but it's definitely challenging.
Yeah. We all have regrets. We all, if we had the ability to move time back and have a chance to make a different decision, we all wish we wish we could do that. But that's not how we live our lives, obviously.
No.
We just have to move forward, do the best we can. So yeah, those mentors, they meant everything to me. And hopefully we pay attention when we get around somebody who has great wisdom, the great ability to make things happen, to motivate people, that we get just a tiny tidbit of something worthwhile from them.
Yeah, if you just catch something.
Right? Trying to catch that lightning in the bottle, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. So I think we're all trying to do that every day.
Talking about moving forward, so let's go back to your career, aviation, leading aviators. But there's a transition point in your naval career into, as you mentioned, like more policy, more staff position type stuff. What led to that? And then what was that transition? What was your first job where you're not involved in aviation?
Yeah, being a child of the Cold War, I always knew we had a major adversary, and like a lot of us, we do sports as kids, and we're on a team environment, and we have a common goal. For me, that was part of being in the military during the Cold War, and was not had any personal animus against the Soviets. I felt our way of life, capitalism, individual liberties, was the right way forward for humankind. So I kind of wore that on my sleeve a little bit, and I became more interested in the national security policy apparatus. So again, going back to a mentor, I had a mentor. So I had my first squadron operational tour. Then I was an instructor in a fleet readiness squadron. These are newly winged aviators come and learn how to fly their fleet aircraft, and we teach them that aircraft and that mission. So I did that for 3 years, and then I was looking to do something different from flying, and that mentor provided me an opportunity to work as a young officer in the Pentagon. And so I ended up showing up on the Joint Staff just before Saddam invaded Kuwait, and Colin Powell was the chairman at the time. And I was 29 years old, and my eyes were wide open, and all these things were happening. And this was our first really great test since Vietnam, and the military had still been suffering from some melees from the American public from, Vietnam, post-Vietnam era. So this is our first major test as a military, and we had great leadership at the time. I thought Bush Sr. did a great job pulling the coalition together. We had, I think, Brent Scowcroft was National Security Advisor at the time. Robert Gates was the Deputy National Security Advisor. We had Colin Powell as the chairman. Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense. They just did a great job pulling together a real coalition, and they had that mission of ejecting Iraq from Kuwait. We spent 6 months building that coalition, and then we executed that.
Was it
combat.
Am I remembering right? Schwarzkopf, was that?
Schwarzkopf was the CENTCOM commander.
Yeah.
And he pulled that all together.
I remember watching like a briefing after our initial response. And I remember him describing just like the level we went to destroy their anti-aircraft capability, and just how we thought it would be more of not necessarily a peer-to-peer conflict, but I guess maybe we planned for it to be more of an equal combat, when it was just like we just devastated them.
It was certainly a major regional conflict. That was one of the scenarios that we planned for. It wasn't what I would call a peer conflict, peer adversary conflict, but certainly the Iraqi army was, in terms of numbers, very capable.
At the time, they were like the fourth largest.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, the Powell Doctrine was to bring in as much force as we possibly could bring to bear on the situation so that we minimized our loss of life. But again, that was a culmination of many years of a Reagan buildup in terms of not only in weapons, but mainly in how we trained our troops and the culture. And that was a real test for us. And we did well. We did much better than we anticipated. We were very fortunate.
Well, and you started sort of by attributing that success to great leadership at the time. And you mentioned Colin Powell, who, I've been pretty connected to politics since I was a teenager, always been pretty interested.
Mm-hmm.
He's about the only chairman of the Joint Chiefs whose name I can still sort of pull out of my head. What was it about him that made him such a strong figure in that role?
Well, I would say for the young officers, he was very charismatic in the way he spoke, the way he treated his subordinates on the staff, the way he conducted themselves, the integrity, the way he treated, and he was very, very humble. And he was unbelievably inspirational to the people that worked for him. I don't know, I can't put my finger on that exact ingredient. I think that's true of a lot of very, very effective leaders. You can't exactly, you can reel off a few characteristics, but to actually pin it on one thing, that's very difficult to do. It was a combination of things, of characteristics and behaviors that he had that made him special.
I can imagine there's a gravitas to people like that. I had, early in my defense contractor career, I grew up in the IT industry as a technician, and I made a foray into working for a defense contractor in the IT, and ended up running the IT department at a defense contractor. And we had a board of directors, and they brought in a 4-star general to chair it. And he had been at the time prior, like he was, a coalition commander of Afghanistan, like a heavy hitter. And I remember my first interaction with him, like I couldn't put my finger on it, but that was when that guy entered the room changed. There's a gravitas to him where I found it very impressive, and tried to like pay attention, just the questions he asked, the way he treated people, and try to tie, how I run things sort of back to some of those lessons, try to grab onto what little bit I could.
That's right.
But I couldn't say exactly what it was.
That's right. They have a unique combination of skills that make them special, and they're able to bring people together, and they are able to solicit opinion from subordinates, things that matter, truths that people have a hard time speaking sometimes in a military environment, right? That's what that person's able to draw out of that organization, and they can do it like very few others can do it. That's a special place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And humble, I think, is a key term. I feel like most great leaders I've interacted with, military or otherwise, tend to be pretty humble.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They have enough on their plate, right?
Right.
And they're trying to pull it all together.
It gives you confidence too when you work with somebody or work for a leader like that who is willing to admit when they don't know something. That gives you a lot of confidence, because then okay, they understand their limits.
That's right.
That's awesome. That's what you want. I think sometimes when you're trying to become a leader, two big lessons that I've learned. One is that leadership is a skill.
Right.
Sometimes you look at people and it looks effortless, and you get frustrated if you're not having such easy success, but then you have to kind of realize, it's a skill. You got to think about it. You have to actually be, purposeful about it. And then the other is, you can sometimes think as a leader, your job is to never not know the answer, and to always just come across as fully confident. You can never show that vulnerability. And I found the opposite is true. When I tell my team, like, no, I don't have the right answer to this, let's discuss it. I'll take accountability for the ultimate decision. But I don't have the answer, guys. That's what this team is about. That's why we're all here, is so we can work on this together. Those have been valuable lessons.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be willing to admit that you don't have all the answers, and you don't have the answer. And many times you have to be willing to say, and guess what? We don't have to solve this problem today. So let's gather some more information. Let's try to solve this tomorrow or next week.
So what's life like at the Pentagon working for the Joint Chiefs as a young officer?
I would say that when you're an ensign or a second lieutenant just starting out, and you don't know anything, you don't realize that you're not supposed to know anything, and people don't have any expectations of you, so to speak. You don't know that at the time. Now, fast forward, I'm on the Joint Staff, and I'm a Navy lieutenant. I didn't know a thing, and there weren't any expectations on me, except that this time I realized there weren't any expectations. So any little thing that I could do to contribute was helpful. I was hoping it was helpful to my superiors. So you try to do something to make their lives easier because they have a lot on their plate. The other part would be you're in a unique place. You're getting a lot of exposure that you wouldn't be able to get in any other job. So take advantage of every opportunity to learn something about the environment that you're in. So I tried to learn as much as I could about how the Pentagon worked. How does the Joint Staff work with the SecDef staff upstairs? How do they work with the service staffs getting things done? What are the other agencies that are involved in the different issues that we work on a day-to-day basis? Those are the things that I was trying to learn from an organizational perspective when I was in that job. That was only for a couple of years. Right?
At some point, you then ended up at the White House.
That came much later.
Okay.
After that tour, I went back went back to the fleet as a lieutenant commander in an operational squadron, and finished out a aviation career in the Navy. And then I went back there as a more senior officer, not a senior officer, but more middle-level management as a Navy commander.
Do you find that transition difficult, go from operational to then policy and getting your arms around the Pentagon and all the apparatus and then going back operational?
For I think most career military officers, you're used to a different assignment every 2 or 3 years. So after 20 years, you've been exposed to a number of different organizations and a number of different roles, and you realize you have to learn your job pretty quickly. So you get about 6 months of time to learn your new job, and then you're expected to perform at a pretty high level. So that's the nature of the beast, and you get used to that rhythm, I would say. Coming into that job in the White House, I was the deputy director of operations, and I got there about 6 weeks before 9/11 happened, and I wasn't ready for that, of course. I don't know that anybody could be, but there were people much smarter than I was who were in the job already, who bore the burden of those first few days.
What
Right.
this is the most loaded of questions because I'm sure there's so many angles to take on it. But what was that like to be there as part of that institution when that happened?
Good question. Of course, the first day was totally unexpected. Nobody could be prepared for something like that. I actually believe most people that wore the uniform fully knew that there's nothing special about the United States in terms of vulnerability. We're as vulnerable to an attack like that as any other country. Most of us felt that we weren't prepared as a country for an attack like that. We knew it was going to be a matter of time. I believe we were more worried it was going to be a weapon of mass destruction. As bad as 9/11 was and the loss of life that we had, if it had been a small nuke or chem-by or something of that nature, the loss of life could have been much greater. And perhaps it required something of like that for our country to wake up to what those threats are. And I think that once we, as a country, faced that threat, we did a pretty good job of ramping up and meeting that. So I think for a lot of military folks, this is something that we expected. And actually we had a sense of relief afterwards because it could have been much worse. And that's kind of a hard thing to say, but I think we actually felt that. I'll give you a little bit of analogy about the way the military professionals looked at it. After 9/11, the military brought in many chaplains to provide counseling services for the staff on the White House grounds, because the White House had clearly been a target that day. We were fortunate that we avoided an incident of that type. But there was counseling provided to, as I understand, several hundred of the staffers over the next couple of months, and not one of them was a uniformed military person. I think that most of us, all of us, before we got there, realized that we're mortal, that we face these type of conflicts every day, and we come to grips with that on our own personal term somehow before that ever happened. So that we'd been through that already, that thought process. That's kind of an interesting thing.
Well, that first day, I'm sure the shock and the, figuring out, okay, we got to do something about this and take action. I imagine that first day was overwhelming, but what are the days following? Like when when the dust, the proverbial and literal dust settled, what was that like? What was the spin up? What were the conversations? What was what was the environment like?
Yeah, it was obviously chaotic. Our job, we had specific duties. There was we had the operations side, so half of the job was making sure the assets that supported the executive branch, president, vice president, cabinet officers, was all working correctly to support their movements and transportation. The other half of the job are what we call the continuity of government, continuity of presidency operations. So it was a whole different set of programs around that to support that mission. All of those responsibilities changed, of course. After 9/11, if you were in the executive branch and you could use U.S. government transportation, you wanted to use that. You weren't going to fly on the airline. So our government transportation system became overloaded immediately with requests to move government officials around. So that was a challenge. We had to bring more capacity online to meet those transportation requirements, whether it's helicopters or airplanes to take congressmen or administration officials to where they needed to go to do their business. And then on the other side of the program side, all of those programs changed overnight as well. I could tell you that we were under-resourced for all those programs before 9/11. And then after 9/11, there's a flood of resources that come to you.
I can imagine.
Right. And it's a good thing, bad thing, because you really need those resources, but it also opens potential up for spend money unwisely as well. But we didn't have the luxury of time. Right.
Yeah. One of the things I remember about 9/11, I was in middle school, and there was a certain feeling to the country, and, we kind of knew about Desert Storm and about Iraq and whatnot growing up, but it was very distant. 9/11 made it all very real. And so for me, there's a clear line in my life as a citizen of like pre and post 9/11. And I do remember in the following days, one, of course, the rise, the inspirational rise of patriotism and the collective, like, hey, we're all in this together, was, something that you look back on. You hate that it happened, but you look back on and say, what a hell of a response,
Right.
You love that part of it. But I remember the uncertainty and sort of the fear for years. And that's me as a kid. And at the time I was living in like Florida. I wonder what that was like, again, to be at like the White House at a target, knowing that uncertainty exists and that you are a target.
I would say for most of us who were working there, we really didn't have time to consider that, were we a target? Yeah, probably. But, when you're flying in the Persian Gulf or some other place, you've been a target before also, right? So I don't think it wasn't necessarily unknown territory, but for most of us, we were just extremely busy. We were working, 12, 14-hour days, 6, 7 days a week, sometimes trying to put things into place to handle the new threat or new contingencies or new ways of doing things. So very, very busy. I had 2 daughters in middle school at the time. We could see some uncertainty in their faces as well. So there are a lot of questions at home. And I was gone a lot. And I really regret that from that time period. We were resource limited in terms of people. There are only so many people that are cleared for that environment. It's very hard to get additional. You can't ramp up people overnight in those positions. That was very hard. So the burden was placed on the people who were already working there. So for everybody, civilian, military alike, in that environment, it just became a huge burden. We're just doing the best we could, and we're trying to keep our head above water.
Yeah, I imagine the clarity of mission and the necessity. I wasn't there, but I can't imagine a lot of people would have said no. Like,
right,
you're there, you answered the call.
This is where you are, and by fate or fortune or or misfortune. It is what it is, and you just get on with it.
What was it like in the ramp up to, the initial response into Afghanistan?
I could probably tell you a little bit of a story, and I think it'd be safe describing that because part of our job was managing transportation, and suddenly we have this conflict that's building up in Afghanistan. We're starting to move material from the United States into that combat zone. There's something called the TIPFID. You may have heard this phrase, but it's time phase forward deployed list. That's it. It's an Air Force term, so the Navy guys usually mess it up. I'm sure I did. But it's a computerized program that determines what you move into a combat theater in what sequence. So you got to make sure that you're moving like food and stuff before you move humans into the theater. Otherwise, you can't support the buildup of forces, right? So we're starting to execute the TIPFID into Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the president wants to go on his first overseas mission. This was into Asia Pac at the time. He was going to do 10 or 12 locations within a 2-week period. So every time you move the president, it's going to take a minimum of X aircraft, maybe six or 7 aircraft per location, right? Not even overnight, just to go to one location. So if you're adding up 12 or 14 locations, in Asia, the number of airplanes ramps up very quickly, right? So now we're looking at over 100 airplanes when you include like refueling tankers and airlift aircraft going into this theater. And now we're moving all this stuff in Afghanistan. We very quickly run out of airplanes, right? And so now we're starting to get phone calls from the Air Force. Hey, what are we doing? And why are we doing this? And so we had to have that conversation pretty quickly with the administration about what can we really do on this particular visit in Asia Pacific. But it came down to, I think there was a phrase that somebody is, look, we can either fight a war in Afghanistan or we can do a 14-day visit to Asia Pacific, but we can't do both. Which one do you want to do? Okay. So I think that was a wake-up call for some people in the administration was still fairly new at the time, that we actually have a finite number of aircraft in the inventory.
That is fascinating because, boy, sometimes does it feel like the resource pool is endless. And I'm sure that might have been the first time anyone was told, you got to pick one.
Yeah, I have another analogy. Whenever a new administration official came into the White House and it was evident they were going to be traveling with the president, they would come into our office to fill out a preference sheet for what they wanted on Air Force One. Like, do you have any food allergies? What are your food preferences? What part of the team are you with? Where that sort of thing. So we'd get this thing, and when they're brand new, they were very, I'm going to get to fly on Air Force One, blah, blah, blah. There'd be a lot of questions. One of the questions we always got was, so where's the escape pod on Air Force One? The movie just come out. So this escape pod was in the back of their heads. And you don't need to worry about that today. Okay. So we got things like that, but there is very much that belief that we are unlimited in terms of resources and in the capability, and that what Hollywood says about what we're able to do is actually different in reality, right?
Yeah. Well, that goes back to how you said sort of the response from the military professionals to 9/11 was almost expected. Like there was an understanding we were vulnerable, whereas I think the average American, a kid especially, thought from movies and everything like we're untouchable. I often tell people, I'm loosely in the defense industry. Our company supports defense contractors.
Right.
We're not ourselves a defense contractor. So just from what I've seen and who I've interacted with, I always tell folks like, it's not what you see in Jason Bourne movies.
Right.
Even the big contractors, the mega contractors, like they have finite resources, and it's not these amazing centralized centers of decision making where it's a bunch of spy craft and whatnot. It's people going to their 9 to 5, and it's some cases it's an airplane that's been flying for 40 years.
Right.
Like it's not all tip of the spear, bleeding edge stuff all the time.
Yeah, I think I've been flying in the Navy for 6 or 7 years before I flew an airplane that was younger than I was, right?
Yeah.
Right? It's hard to believe. in today's environment. But that's frequently the case. And you're right. Government isn't made up of, we think of the U.S. government as this omniscient organization that has perfect information 100% of the time.
Right.
And so the output is going to be right on, spot on, exactly right. No, it's not that way at all. Sometimes we have a pickup team and we have to make the stuff up on the fly, right?
Yeah.
And we use our whatever experience that we have in our back pocket and whatever expertise on the team to make a decision. And we operate a lot closer to the live wire than you would ever want to imagine, right? Your decisions have major consequences and second and third order effects down the road. It's a very uncomfortable place to be sometimes.
I'm
right?
sure. Yeah, it's like you said, yeah, the human element, people oversimplify or don't understand. It's easy to think it's this big monolith that always knows what's going on, that the CIA always has perfect intel, and
Right.
the Jason Bourne type stuff is happening, the James Bond type stuff is happening, but it's not all that. And culturally, we've got something of a rise in conspiracy theories, especially around the government. There's a lot of skepticism of the government, institutional skepticism.
Right.
And again, when this conversation comes up in my personal life with people that aren't adjacent to the defense industry like I am, I always try to remind them, again, the people in these highest levels where these conspiracies are supposedly happening, they're human beings. You share a secret beyond about 3 people, it tends to get out, and it's not, these are people who go home to their families and have
Right.
children and whatnot. They're not a shadow cabal in all cases. Does some stuff happen? Yeah.
Yep.
It's the rarity, not, it's the exception, not the rule, where I think a lot of people think it's the rule,
I completely agree. I think that's one of the big issues in our country right now is we have people that don't trust each other. And I think for the most part, people who are serving in government, we came from very similar public school systems. We came from a shared set of values. We want to do the right thing when we're in these roles, and that they're making decisions that are in the best interest of the country to the level of experience that they have. I actually believe that, and maybe I'm very, very naive in that way, but I've seen government up close in some instances, and the people in that room who are making these decisions are trying to do the right thing. Doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes. We make bad decisions. We do. And that's one of the beauties of our system. If we make a bad decision, there's going to be a voice, or sometimes a cacophony of voices saying, hey, we're going down the wrong path, consider this. And we can recalibrate and redirect our efforts as a country. We self-correct probably as well or better than anybody else. But generally, the people who are in those leadership roles are trying to do the right thing. Doesn't matter what political party they're in, because we have that sense of shared values.
Yeah, I think that's a fefeature, not a bug. The fact
Absolutely.
that we make mistakes.
Yep.
And that we can voice that, and that we can address that, and we can alter course. You look at some of the more authoritarian governments that are on the rise,
Right.
criticism's not allowed. And the government doesn't make mistakes. You're certainly not allowed to address them. That's not a way to achieve success in my mind.
I agree. Our system can seem very chaotic and disorderly sometimes. But at the very least, the information, almost anything that's known, gets out there eventually. So people can see what that is and discriminate, figure out what the right solutions are, and then move forward together. That's one of the beauties of our system. We get that information out there as quickly as possible. We may not like what we hear, but it's going to get out, right?
Yeah. That diversity of opinions, again, it's a feature, not a bug.
Right.
And, not to get too topical on politics, but there's certainly this feeling of divide. Like you said, there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of distrust. And there's a lot of hyperbolic language I find now about the divide. And I'm big on like revolutionary and early America history. I listen to a lot of audiobooks and stuff about that. The first fist fight in Congress happened a couple of years after the country was founded. The founders, a couple of them dueled each other. Like there's always been a divide and some disagreement, but we've made it, as far as we have. I don't think our current time is something we've never traversed before. I think we can get through it like any other time.
I agree. We've been divisive politically, been all sorts of views out there. And that's been a feature ever since we were founded as a country. If you're going to have freedom of the press, freedom of expression, then you're going to have all sorts of varying political ideas out there. I don't believe in limiting that speech. I believe the antidote to speech that you actually don't like is more speech. And Americans have a responsibility to speak up sometimes. I think most of us don't want to do that or exercise that authority, that right all the time. But when it's important, you should obviously let your opinion be known and give it some life. So yeah, absolutely a feature, not a bug.
I want to go back to something that you talked about, your entrance into the Navy and that as a concept growing up in Chapel Hill in the time of, the Apollo program.
Right.
I wonder, as an admirer of our space program, and that's another area of history that I find fascinating, the Gemini, the Mercury astronauts, the Apollo program, and landing on the moon, what that must have felt like to be, a citizen of the country during that time and the inspiration that must have created.
Yeah, it was very interesting time if you grew up in it and watched it develop as a young person. I was in Chapel Hill watching the TV the night that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, July 20th, 1969, I think was the date. As a young person growing up in that environment, of course, it was in the public school all the time. They were talking about this. It was in the books that you read. We were talking about the Apollo program, what the goals of John F. Kennedy were, and by when. So this goal of getting this done before the decade was out was in the back of every American's mind, not just the people who were working in the industry or the astronauts or at NASA trying to get a human on the moon before the decade. Every American was aware of it. It gave us the sense that if we put our mind to something, we can accomplish that as a country, and that almost anything was achievable. And you look back and you go, how did we actually achieve this? How do we put a person on the moon? And now we have problems getting rockets in the low Earth orbit and getting up to the International Space Station. Kind of hard to believe, especially with the lack of computing resources that we had back then. I would say that we had a very great engineering culture in the United States at the time. We could build almost anything here in the United States. And we had really, really bright people in project management that could make that happen. Then, of course, we had the astronauts themselves who were all test pilots, maybe with a couple of exceptions, but all also very bright. And it was a very, very risky endeavor that they were undertaking. Very inspirational time for a young person. I would say that if you take a look at our space industry today, many of the people who are working in that industry were inspired by the Apollo program. And also the spinoffs that came out, the technological spinoffs that came out of that program were innumerable, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of technology that is part of our day-to-day life that emerges out of that program. GPS is a key example, but then little things like Velcro being required because the astronauts needed a way to adhere things but couldn't use tape. And I'm a great admirer of the space program, and there's a cynicism. Again, there's a lot going on in our country when it comes to divide. There's cynicism. Sometimes I hear people ask, why do we spend money in space? And we talk about a new audacious goal of, hey, putting people back on the moon or going to Mars and really reaching for it and spending money on these things. I have to imagine, again, like you said, having been there, the collective inspiration that created and the generation that it inspired to do things like serve the country.
Right.
We're missing out on that for not having something like that.
Yeah, I'll give you a story. I'm supposed to be renowned for stories. It was December of 72. I was in Charleston growing up there. It was Apollo 17 was the last moonshot. And my parents literally at the last minute said, hey, we're going to go see this thing. So we loaded up in our Plymouth Valiant station wagon and we drove down to Daytona. And then eventually we were parked on the Titusville Causeway during Apollo 17. I was 12 years old. The launch was supposed to happen around 4:30 in the afternoon, as I recall, and they got down to about 30 seconds to go on the automatic sequencer, and it stopped. There was some valve problem, pressure problem. They had to recalibrate, and they were going to launch later. Now, when you stop a countdown like that, and you have to reset everything, it's probably going to take you several hours to rejigger all of that to get ready for their launch. Now, the moon is still moving, right?
Yeah.
The Earth is still going a different direction. So now they've got to re-aim the gantry, right, for
All
the
new
rocket.
calculations.
All the calculations have to be redone. So they reset for about 12:30 midnight. As you may recall, Apollo 17 was the only night launch of a Saturn V. So now it's going off at sometime after midnight. So I remember we had a telescope as a kid, and I was looking at the command module through this telescope, and then they went to the countdown, and it finally went off, and it was like the sun rising. It was a Saturn V rocket, and it was huge, and you could see everything just like as if it was a sun, but the shadows, of course, were moving as the rocket ascended. And I could see all the fish jumping out of the water. They were mullet because I grew up in the creeks back up, on a barrier island in Charleston, and used to fish for those all the time. Anyway, fast forward many years. Now I'm a active duty Navy captain, and I was at an event, and I ran into Gene Cernan, who was mission commander of that mission, last man to walk on the moon, and we talked about that. So
Wow.
who gets, funny thing, who gets to imagine that, right? As a kid, get to see that, and then get to meet one of your heroes someday.
Yeah, I mean, just to see the Saturn V,
right.
What a great opportunity. And one of my great regrets is I loved the space shuttle. I never got to see it in person. It was always like, oh, I wanted to do that. And I almost drove down for the last one. But then, living in Virginia, I was like, they scrub these things. They move the time. It's going to be tough.
No, I never got to see a shuttle launch either, right? Wish I had.
Good news
Absolutely.
is we're seeing new rockets. I just watched the other day, SpaceX did their Starship launch. And now,
Right.
of course, like you can really watch it because they have 8,000 cameras over it, and you can see all of it. And now they have
Right.
all the computers and all the technical advantage. It is still, when you look back at it, what a marvel that they did all of that with a computing power that today would
Right.
barely run a calculator.
And we go, ho-hum. Ain't no big deal. It's another rocket. Well, actually, space is still really, really hard. Still very hard. There's still a lot we haven't worked out. It'll never be a perfect operation. It's always going to be dangerous. And I have even more admiration for those young men and women who go into NASA and put themselves on top of these man-made machines and
Yeah.
going off from the netherworld. That's amazing.
Yeah. At the
So
end of the
what
day,
do they do?
you're
What they do
strapping
is
yourself
amazing.
to
Right.
a rocket.
Rocket.
Don't forget that.
Mhm.
A massive thing of force that could be devastating.
And hopefully in our lifetime we're going to see a man or a lady walk on the moon.
Yeah.
And maybe beyond. We'll see.
I certainly hope so. Going back to sort of the beginning of your origin as well, you mentioned that your parents were scientists, and
Right.
I don't know if in the country at the time you talk about a strong engineering culture and coming from scientists, and having this civilian-led exploration, this not grandiosity necessarily, but this elevation and celebration of science and technology and engineering. Today, I feel like we're kind of not that. We're kind of off of that, and I think we're worse off for that.
Well, we've been sidetracked. I agree with you. There was obviously after World War II, we're one of the few remaining large economies left standing. So we had great advantages in post-World War II time period. We trained a lot of engineers, young engineers during that time for World War II. It was a matter of necessity that we trained experienced people. And so they were able to move into commercial applications of that they picked up in World War II. My family was an example of that. And then we had a lot of investment in the Eisenhower and the Kennedy administration in basic scientific research, which is how my parents got into the sciences. And both of my parents came from working class families. My parents and they both went to college, first generation of the families to go to college. And then they were encouraged by the government to do advanced degrees in science. So we had a real strong base at the time during those years to really learn new things. And we've seen these tech centers develop as a result of a lot of that investment and spending in basic scientific research and knowledge from that era. I agree with you. I think we need to get back to a government-funded effort in technology and engineering so that we can build things ourselves, not just software, but other things, hardware that benefits our country and our allies and partners globally. Not sure how to actually accomplish that, frankly. Right?
Billion or $1 trillion problem necessarily.
That's exactly right.
You said something
a lot of zeros.
I've never heard before, which is, you said at the time in the 60s leading up to the moon landing, everyone in America knew that was the goal. It was like everyone kind of knew that was going to happen, or that was the stated goal. I wonder, culturally having that lofty goal in mind and then going on to achieve it must have created the atmosphere, like you said, of, hey, when America puts its mind to something, it can get it done.
Yeah. And it wasn't just about getting it done either. It was getting it done even in periods of great strife. Remember, we were in Vietnam. Tet Offensive was in early part of 68. That really divided the country. We thought that war was unwinnable, obviously. That tore us apart. There was the issues around the draft. There were significant race issues, right? And issues with economic disparity. So all those were happening in our country. And we like today, we had this feeling that our country is being pulled apart in several different directions. And yet we were able to come together as a country and make this achievement. I think for a lot of Americans, that was a redemption for surviving the late 60s and all the generational issues that came out of that. Hey, we were able to, no matter all the bad things that happened in the strife that our country went through, we were able to achieve this in the end, right? There was a quote, and some of you may have heard of this. So in December 68, Apollo 8 circumnavigated the moon, first time any humans actually circumnavigated.
Jim Lovell.
Right. Jim Lovell was on that flight. Gosh, I'm drawing a blank here. The mission commander was Frank Borman. And third guy was, come on, help me out here.
I don't know the third. I just remember Jim Lovell.
He was a Navy guy, and I can't remember why I'm blanking my name. But it'll come to me. Anyway, so they circumnavigate. They're on the way back, and there was this HBO special where they're talking about, hey, we pulled in some quotes off the wire, some people talking out. There was a message from Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh about one of the greatest achievements in mankind. And but one of the most famous quote that came out of that mission was, "You saved 1968," right?
What do they mean by that?
This was after the Martin Luther King assassination and after Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated and after all the anti-Vietnam War protests and what happened at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 68. It was just a really, really awful year for us.
We so on our podcast, we talk a lot about optimism because we deal in national security threats and scary stuff and AI and China and all the scary stuff, but we talk a lot about optimism. And I always ask people where they find their optimism. I wonder if, dealing with all that strife and all that difficulty and the war, and as you mentioned, 1968, all the bad stuff that happened, they're having that space program as like this unifying optimistic force, balance that out. And maybe that's something that we're missing today. Cause boy, do I sometimes feel like all I see is strife and difficulty and challenge. Some of that's the algorithm trained to get our engagement, but we also are kind of missing that thing that we're all working toward, which I think is part of the divide.
Yeah. So what is that unifying thing that we're looking for? I mean, what is going to make that happen? I've come to believe we're not going to find that in a person. Okay. I don't think there's going to be one unifying figure that's going to be able to do that for us as a country. it could be an event that brings us together. We talked about that a little bit in the first part of the program. It's going to be something, I think, that's going to pull us together. We're going to have to lean on those shared values, on those things that make us Americans, who we are. Doesn't matter what our skin color is, doesn't matter what our gender is, doesn't matter where we grew up. It's going to make those, it's going to be something that makes us who we are as Americans. That's what's going to bring us together. I don't know what that catalyst is going to be. I'm trying to figure that out myself.
Yeah, that's a big challenge. Well, the way we end the podcast is we talk about optimism. And like I said, I'd love to ask people where their optimism comes from. Because I find people who spend a career in the government or in the military, so mission focused, still, you can sort of draw your line from space program to still helping partner nations because you believe in the United States and the force for good that we are. To survive all that and to continue doing it must mean you have some optimism. Like there's hope for the future for you. And where do you get your optimism?
Now, this is highly personal, of course. So
yeah,
you're asking me what my opinion is. It comes from, probably like most of us, many different sources. I'm a man of faith now. I wasn't that way as a young person, but I've grown into it over a course of a lifetime, and having things happen to me that have kind of very clearly laid out what my belief system is. It comes from your close family and friends. As I mentioned, there's probably, I can list on one hand the number of important mentors that I've ever had in my lifetime, that I still lean on that wisdom in my daily life. Certainly lean on my family for that support. And in trying to find a place of work where your daily work means something. It's mission oriented, that the people that you work with, you can trust. Doesn't mean you're always going to agree with each other. Doesn't mean you're not going to yell at each other from time to time, right? That's part of it. But it means that you have the same goals and the same value system, and you're going to work together to achieve an outcome. And sometimes that you may set goals that aren't going to be achievable, but you have to keep working towards those things. So, yeah, that's where I draw my optimism from. And you need to have a sense of humor too.
Yeah, I find you can't take everything too seriously.
Right.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end on, Bill. That was fantastic. We covered topics that were not in my plan at all.
Not mine either.
Hey, that's sometimes the best conversation.
Right.
So are you on social media, or is there anywhere anyone should look you up and reach out to you if they're interested?
Actually, I'm not a big on social media. Our company has a website. There's a network of people that we work with in this industry. You can reach out to them. Happy to provide, if anybody has interest in some of the topics that we broached here, to connect with them on those, and have further conversations. Be glad to do that.
Awesome. Well, Bill, appreciate you spending the time with us. This is fantastic.
Enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, Andy.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Watchers. For more great content, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our channel. We'll see you on the next one.